The music had not yet begun, but the ballroom at Harrington House was already a sea of sound, the rustle of silk, the murmur of 100 conversations, the delicate clink of crystal. For Frances Alcott, it was the sound of her own humiliation, amplified and set to the bright, merciless glare of 1,000 candles. She stood near a pillar, where the shadows were deepest, her hands clenched at her sides. The gown, a pale yellow relic of her stepmother's youth, had been let out at the seams, the stitches crude and obvious against the fine brocade. It was a gown meant for a woman with a fuller figure and a smaller spirit. But it was the hair that drew the stares, the whispers that coiled around her like smoke. The night before, her stepsisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, had held her down in a chair, their laughter like the shattering of thin glass, and with a pair of sewing shears, had shorn her dark hair to the chin. The cuts were rough, uneven, a deliberate act of mutilation designed to make her a gargoyle at the ball where she had hoped, foolishly, to be invisible. Every eye in the room seemed to find her, assess the damage, and dismiss her. She was a curiosity, a cautionary tale, the plain Alcott girl, made plainer still by a cruel prank. She could feel the pity, which was worse than the scorn. It was a sticky, cloying thing that threatened to suffocate her. The orchestra master tapped his baton, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the noise. A hush fell. The first dance was the domain of the highest ranking, the most beautiful. The Duke of Harrington, master of this house and all the lands for miles, would choose his partner. Frances watched him from across the floor. He was not a handsome man in the way of poets, but he was striking. Tall and severe, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, he stood with a stillness that seemed to draw all the light and sound in the room toward him. His face was a study in harsh lines and controlled discipline, his reputation colder than the marble of his foyer. He would choose Lady Annalise, of course, with her hair like spun gold and a dowry that could fund a small war. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, scanned the room. They passed over the hopeful, blushing faces of the county's finest daughters, over the glittering diamonds and the perfectly coiffed hair. They moved past Eleanor and Beatrice, preening in their new silks. And then they stopped. On her, on the ruined girl by the pillar. A tremor went through Francis, a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear. He had seen her, the object of ridicule, but his expression was not one of pity or disgust. It was one of assessment, as cool and impersonal as a surveyor judging a plot of land. Then he began to move. Not toward Lady Annalise, not toward anyone else. He crossed the polished floor, his steps measured and silent, a black-clad ship cutting a path through a sea of brightly colored silks. The whispers died. The air grew thin. He stopped before her. He was taller than she had imagined. The scent of clean linen and cold night air clung to his coat. "Miss Alcott," he said. His voice was a low baritone, without inflection, a statement of fact. He extended a gloved hand. "May I have this dance?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Frances could only stare, her mind a blank slate. Behind him, she could see the stunned, furious faces of her stepsisters. She could feel the collective gasp of the entire assembly. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, impersonal. He led her to the center of the floor as the first notes of the waltz began to play. If you wish to understand why the most powerful man in the county chose the girl everyone else had discarded, subscribe for more stories just like this. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. The story of Frances Alcott did not begin in a ballroom, but in a dusty, neglected study at Alcott Manor, a house that was slowly consuming itself. Her father, a gentle scholar with a love for rare books and a complete disregard for finance, had left behind little but debts and a second wife with a soul as barren as the fallow East Field. Lady Alcott treated Frances not as a daughter, but as an unpaid, unacknowledged steward. It was Frances who managed the ledgers, her fine, clear script tracking every shilling. It was Frances who placated the tenants, who renegotiated with the grain merchant, whose careful planning kept the bailiffs from the door. In private, her stepmother would praise her sharp mind. "You have a head for figures, child," she would say, tapping the ledger, a useful, if unlovely, talent. But in public, Frances was invisible, a plain, quiet creature who was good with accounts and little else. Her stepsisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, were the family's showpieces. Their beauty was their currency, and they spent it lavishly on gowns and ribbons, while Frances mended her own clothes by candlelight. They treated her with the casual cruelty of those who have never been denied anything. They took her mother's few remaining pieces of jewelry, wore her dresses until they were worn out, and mocked her quiet nature. "She's more like a piece of furniture than a girl," Beatrice had once declared, loud enough for Frances to hear. The night they cut her hair was the culmination of 1,000 smaller cruelties. Frances had received a letter from a distant cousin, a modest clergyman with a small parish, hinting at a visit. It was the faintest glimmer of a possible escape, a life away from the suffocating atmosphere of the manor. Eleanor found the letter. "A suitor?" she had sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "For her? We can't have her embarrassing the family name with some country parson." That night, they cornered her in her room. Eleanor, strong and merciless, held her arms while Beatrice, with a triumphant gleam in her eye, took up the shears. "A proper lady must be well groomed," she had whispered, and began to cut. The sound of her hair falling to the floor was the sound of her last hope being severed. They left her there, surrounded by the dark, ragged locks, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Her only comfort was Mrs. Gable, the old housekeeper who had served her mother. She found Frances on the floor, dry-eyed and still. Mrs. Gable said nothing, simply swept up the hair, brought a warm cloth for her face, and left a plate with a thick slice of bread and cheese. It was an act of quiet solidarity in a house devoid of kindness. Frances had gone to the ball, not with hope, but with a kind of grim defiance. She would not hide. She would let them see what they had done. She would stand in her ill-fitting gown and her ruined hair, and she would endure. She had not expected a rescue. She had not known that rescue could come in the form of a cold, silent duke whose gaze missed nothing. After the dance, the duke led her from the ballroom, his hand a firm, guiding pressure on her elbow. The crowd parted before them as if by magic. He did not take her to the drawing room where refreshments were served, but down a quiet, wood-paneled corridor to a small, private study. A fire burned low in the grate. He closed the door, shutting out the world. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a leather armchair. It was not a request. Frances sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, his formidable presence dominating the small room. "I will be direct, Miss Alcott. I require a wife." He stated it as one might state the need for a new roof or a healthier strain of livestock. "The title demands it. The estate requires a duchess to manage its affairs. I have been observing you for some time." Frances's brows furrowed. "Observing me?" "Not you," he clarified, his tone devoid of any flattery. "Your work. I am acquainted with the steward of the Pembroke estate, which borders your family's land. He speaks of the Alcott ledgers. He says they are a work of art, that a failing property has been held together by a single, astute mind. Yours. The revelation was so unexpected it left her speechless. He had not seen a pitiable girl. He had seen a competent manager. I require that mind for my own household, he continued. Harrington Hall is inefficient. It needs a firm hand. I am offering you the position. Francis stared at him. The position of your wife? The position of the Duchess of Harrington, he corrected. The terms are these. You will have my name and my protection. You will have a home, security, and a budget at your complete discretion to manage my estates in Yorkshire and London. You will want for nothing material. In return, you will perform the duties of a duchess, host when necessary, oversee the staff, and bring order to the chaos my last steward has created. He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. What I will not offer you is affection. I have no heart for such things. This will be a partnership, a contract, nothing more. The silence that followed was absolute. Frances thought of Alcott Manor, of the constant smiling cruelty. She thought of the whispers, the pity, the cold dread of a future spent as an unwanted burden. The Duke of Harrington offered something else. Not love, not warmth, but a brutal, chilling honesty. And in that honesty, there was a strange kind of safety. Cold indifference was a fortress. False affection was a prison. I accept your terms, Your Grace, she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she thought possible. The agreement was sealed without a handshake. An hour later, a carriage was brought around to a side entrance. Frances was fetched from the ballroom by a footman, leaving behind her stepmother and stepsisters, their faces a mask of confused fury. She rode in silence beside the Duke, the darkness of the countryside rushing past the windows. Harrington Hall loomed out of the night, a vast Gothic silhouette of stone and slate against the moonless sky. It was less a house and more a fortress, a monument to power and isolation. Inside, the great hall was cold, the air still and heavy. A severe, gray-haired woman in a black dress stood waiting. Mrs. Croft, my housekeeper, the Duke said. This is Miss Alcott. She will be your new mistress. Mrs. Croft's eyes flickered over Frances's rough hair and borrowed dress, her expression unreadable, but far from welcoming. A steward, a man with a perpetually sour look, bowed stiffly. A young maid with wide, frightened eyes curtsied, her gaze fixed on the floor. This was her new home. A cold palace, a silent staff, and a husband who was her employer. It was, she thought, a perfectly survivable arrangement. In the first weeks, Frances learned the language of Harrington Hall, and it was a language of silence. Footsteps were muffled by thick carpets, doors were closed with a soft click, and the staff moved through the vast corridors like specters. The Duke was a ghost in his own house, present only at their formal, nearly wordless dinners, or as a fleeting shadow passing a doorway. He had given her a task, and she dedicated herself to it with the same methodical focus she had applied to the Alcott ledgers. Her first request was for the household accounts. Mr. Davies, the resentful steward, produced them with a sniff of disapproval, as if a woman's mind could not possibly comprehend such complexities. Frances spent 3 days in the estate office, a small, cold room with a single window overlooking a paved courtyard. The ledgers were a disaster, a tangle of overinflated invoices, questionable expenses, and outright neglect. She found that the butcher had been charging them double the market rate for years, that the wine merchant was billing for vintages never delivered, and that Mr. Davies himself was drawing a secondary salary from a tenant farm that was supposed to be in arrears. She began her work not with accusations, but with quiet, relentless efficiency. She sent for the butcher, and with his own invoices spread before him, renegotiated a new contract on the spot. He left pale and sweating. She wrote a polite but firm letter to the wine merchant, requesting a full refund for the undelivered stock. A crate of their finest claret arrived the next day with a note of groveling apology. She said nothing to Mr. Davies about the tenant farm, but simply corrected the accounts to show the income, and adjusted his salary ledger accordingly. He turned a shade of puce, but did not dare to challenge her. Her domain was the house, and she explored it methodically. Entire wings were shrouded in dust cloths, the furniture looming like pale ghosts beneath the linen. The air was stale with disuse. She ordered the shutters opened, the windows washed, the cloths removed. Sunlight, for the first time in years, streamed into the long galleries, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She discovered the gardens, a vast, sprawling wilderness that had once been a masterpiece of landscape design. Roses grew wild, their delicate blooms choked by thorns and weeds. The stone paths were obscured by moss, and the fountains were dry and cracked. In a small, dilapidated cottage at the edge of the woods, she found Mr. Hemlock, the ancient groundskeeper. He told her the late Duchess, Alistair's mother, had adored the gardens. After her death, the old Duke had lost heart, and his son had never cared for such things. Frances began to spend her afternoons there, working alongside Mr. Hemlock. She learned to prune the roses, to identify the herbs in the overgrown kitchen garden, to clear the paths with her own hands. The physical work was a balm, a way to cultivate life in a place that felt frozen in time. The staff's attitude began to thaw. Sarah, the young maid assigned to her, lost her frightened look and would bring Frances a cup of tea in the garden without being asked. Mrs. Croft, the severe housekeeper, began to consult her on menus, her expression softening from disapproval to a grudging respect when Frances's suggestions saved £20 in the weekly budget. The Duke watched it all. Frances would feel his eyes on her from his study window as she staked a climbing rose. She would look up from the ledgers to see him standing in the doorway of the office, his expression unreadable, before he turned and walked away. Their dinners remained a bastion of silence, but the quality of the silence was changing. It was no longer empty. It was watchful. One evening, he looked up from his plate and asked, "The East Wing, you've had it opened?" "Yes," she replied. It seemed a waste of good sunlight. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. But as he looked at her, Frances thought she saw something flicker in his cool gray eyes. It was not warmth, not yet. It was curiosity. The library at Harrington Hall was the one room in the house that felt truly alive. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with a rolling ladder and the perpetual scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax. A great fireplace dominated one wall, and its fire was always lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the spines of 1,000 silent storytellers. It became a place of unspoken truce between Frances and the Duke. After their silent dinners, they would often both retreat there, he to a large leather armchair by the fire with a political journal, she to a window seat with a novel. They rarely spoke, but the shared silence was different from the one at the dinner table. It was companionable, the quiet hum of 2 minds engaged in a similar pursuit. One rainy evening, Frances was searching for a text on garden design, a book Mr. Hemlock had mentioned was in the late Duchess's collection. The section on botany was on the highest shelf. She maneuvered the heavy oak ladder into place and climbed, her fingers tracing the faded gilt titles. Tucked behind a row of thick botanical encyclopedias, almost completely hidden, was a dark leather folio. It was out of place, not a book at all. Curious, she eased it out. It was heavier than she expected. Descending the ladder, she carried it to a reading table under a gas lamp and untied the ribbon. Her breath caught in her throat. The documents inside were not about Harrington Hall. They were about Alcott Manor. There were deeds, surveys, and copies of mortgages dating back 20 years, and at the very bottom, a final set of papers, dated 6 months prior, signed in a bold, decisive hand. The Duke of Harrington had purchased the entirety of her family's debt. He was the creditor her stepmother had feared, the one with the power to cast them all out onto the road. The entire foundation of their arrangement, his cold, transactional honesty, crumbled into dust. This was not a rescue. It was an acquisition. He hadn't chosen her for her competence. He had purchased her along with the estate, a final living asset. A cold fury, unlike anything she had ever felt, rose within her. Every betrayal she had ever suffered paled in comparison to this one. The smiling cruelty of her stepsisters was a known poison. This was a dagger disguised as a shield. She did not hesitate. She did not weep. She gathered the papers, retied the folio, and walked directly out of the library and down the corridor to his study. The door was ajar, a sliver of light falling across the hallway. He was at his desk, writing a letter. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral. She walked to the desk and placed the folio squarely in front of him. The soft thud of the leather on the polished wood was the only sound in the room. He looked at the folio, then back at her face. He saw the ice in her eyes. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a partner in a contract who has just discovered a hidden clause written in invisible ink. He did not feign ignorance. He looked at the papers, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "My father and yours were friends once. Before your father's financial creativity outpaced his resources." The words were clipped, precise. "I watched your stepmother mismanage what little was left. I watched her sell off parcels of land for a fraction of their worth to fund your sister's London seasons. The final creditor was a man named Abernathy, a vulture. He intended to foreclose and leave you all with nothing." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "I bought the debt to stop him." Frances said nothing, her expression unwavering. "I had intended only to hold it, to prevent the worst," he continued, his voice lower now, "to give you time. But I learned of your work with the ledgers. I saw what you were doing, holding back the tide with nothing but ink and intellect. And I saw how they treated you." His gaze flickered for a moment, a flash of something hard and cold. The night of the ball, that was an impulse, a convergence of problems. I needed a duchess of intelligence and fortitude. You needed an escape. It seemed an efficient solution for us both. "You manipulated me," she stated, the words flat and hard. "Yes," he admitted, without apology. "I did. I offered you a cage, but it was a larger and better furnished one than the one you were in. I did not lie about the terms, Frances, only about the events that led to my proposal. It was not an apology. It was a confession, an imperfect, brutally honest admission. Something that had been hidden between them was now in the open, a raw and uncomfortable truth laid bare on the polished surface of his desk. The fragile truce established by the Duke's confession was tested less than a fortnight later. A fine black carriage, ostentatious and loud, crunched up the gravel drive of Harrington Hall. From her place in the newly organized estate office, Frances recognized the crest on the door with a sinking feeling. It belonged to Mr. Thorne, the man to whom she had been briefly and transactionally betrothed. Through the window, she watched as her stepmother, Lady Alcott, emerged, followed by Mr. Thorne himself. Beatrice and Eleanor were not with them. This was not a social call. This was a sortie. A footman announced their arrival. Frances met them in the grand foyer, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. She was not the girl with the ruined hair anymore. She was the Duchess, and this was her house. Alistair must have been alerted, for he appeared at the top of the grand staircase, descending slowly, his presence a silent, formidable weight. He did not speak, but stood beside Frances, a bulwark of severe black wool and quiet power. "Frances, my dear," Lady Alcott began, her voice dripping with a false, syrupy concern. "We were so worried. To be swept away in such a manner. We came to ensure you are well." Mr. Thorne stepped forward, attempting a charming smile that did not reach his eyes. "Frances, I am here to tell you that all is forgiven. Your rash decision, I understand. The Duke is a powerful man, but your prior attachment is to me. We can still put things right." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Frances looked at the man who had been perfectly content to discard her when a wealthier heiress had appeared on the horizon, now claiming an attachment that had never existed. "There was no attachment, Mr. Thorne," Frances said, her voice clear and carrying in the cavernous hall. "There was a business arrangement your father made with my stepmother, an arrangement you were eager to dissolve. As for my decision, it was not rash. It was the most rational choice I have ever made." Lady Alcott's smile tightened. "Now, Frances, do not be difficult. There are certain legal matters. Your father's will is complex. Our solicitor believes your marriage may not be entirely valid without my consent as your guardian." There it was, the threat, wrapped in the language of legal concern. They wanted money. They wanted leverage. They wanted her back under their control. Before Alistair could speak, Frances took a step forward. She had spent a lifetime being silent, her voice buried under the weight of their expectations and their cruelty. "No more. My father's will appointed me as executor of his personal effects upon my majority, which I have reached. It appointed you, madam, as guardian of my person, a role you abdicated through neglect and cruelty. I am the Duchess of Harrington. This is my home. You have no legal standing here. You have no moral standing here. You are not welcome." The words hung in the air, sharp and precise as cut glass. Lady Alcott paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Mr. Thorne's charm evaporated, revealing the petty, grasping man beneath. It was then that Alistair moved. He did not speak for her, but in support of her. He addressed Mr. Thorne directly. "I am aware of the legal theory your solicitor has concocted," he said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "My own solicitors reviewed it last week. It is without merit. Any further attempts to harass or contact my wife will be met with the full force of the law. I believe the footman will show you out." He made a small gesture, and the doors to Harrington Hall were opened. Defeated, humiliated, Lady Alcott and Mr. Thorne retreated, their grand carriage seeming much smaller as it crunched its way back down the drive. The great doors closed, plunging the foyer into silence. Frances stood, her hands clenched, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly receding. She had not been rescued. She had spoken for herself, and her husband had stood with her, not as a savior, but as an ally. They were alone in the vast, silent hall, the air electric with what had just passed between them, and between the world and them. That night, the library was not a refuge, but a necessity. The confrontation had left Frances feeling hollowed out, the old ghosts of Alcott Manor whispering in the quiet corners of her mind. She sat in the window seat, watching the moon rise over the dark, skeletal shapes of the trees, when Alistair entered. He did not take his usual chair but came to stand near her, his presence a dark, solid shape against the firelight. The silence between them was no longer watchful or companionable. It was charged, heavy with the day's events. "You were magnificent today," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the still air. It was a simple, unadorned statement of fact, yet coming from him, it felt like the highest praise. "I only said what was true," she replied, her gaze still fixed on the moonlit garden. "It is a rare thing to say the truth so plainly to those who rely on lies." He was quiet for a long moment. "When I saw them in the hall," he began, his voice different now, tighter, "speaking to you as if you were still their property to be managed and sold, I felt a coldness. I have not felt such a thing in a very long time." He moved from the window to the fireplace, resting one arm on the marble mantelpiece, staring down into the flames. "I was betrothed once, years ago, to a woman named Lady Isabel. I thought I loved her. It turned out she loved my title and was in league with a cousin of mine who wished to see me ruined. The betrayal was comprehensive. It taught me that emotion is a liability, a weakness to be exploited." Frances turned from the window to look at him properly. In the flickering light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, the mask of ducal severity cracking to reveal the man beneath. "So I built walls," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made my world one of contracts, of logic, of transactions. Emotions were unpredictable, unreliable. My proposal to you, Frances, was meant to be the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a perfect, logical arrangement." He looked up from the fire, and his gray eyes found hers across the room. They were raw, stripped of their usual cool distance. "It is no longer a logical arrangement." He crossed the space between them in 2 silent strides. He did not touch her, but stood before her chair, so close she could feel the heat from the fire on his coat. "When I made my vow to protect you, I believed it was a clause in our contract. Today I understood it was not. It was an instinct, a thing I would do without thought, without condition." He reached out then, not to take her hand, but to gently touch her cheek, his thumb brushing over the sharp line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, yet warm and firm. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling tenderness. "I find my house is no longer silent," he murmured, his gaze searching hers. "It has been for 10 years, but it is not silent anymore. It is quiet, because you are in it." The distinction was everything. Silence was an absence. Quiet was a presence. The wall he had built around his heart had not been stormed or broken down. A door had been found, left unlocked, and she had simply walked through it without even knowing. In that moment, the contract between them burned away, leaving something real and terrifying and beautiful in its place. The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock, a summons to the Duchess of Northumberland's annual winter ball. It was the premier event of the London season, a place where reputations were made or irrevocably broken. Alistair placed it on the breakfast table between them. "We should attend," he said. It was not a question. Francis understood. Their marriage, born of provincial scandal and whispered speculation, needed to be legitimized in the eyes of the ton. This would be their public debut, a trial by gaslight and gossip. Francis felt a tremor of the old fear, the memory of the Harrington Assembly, but it was a distant echo now. She was not the same woman. When they entered the Northumberland ballroom, a hush fell, followed by a wave of murmurs. All eyes were on them. Frances was on Alistair's arm, her spine straight, her head held high. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a color chosen to match the depths of a winter sky. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly cut, a testament to quiet confidence rather than ostentatious wealth. Her hair, once a source of shame, had grown into a sleek, dark bob that framed her face, an unconventional but striking style that set her apart from the elaborately coiffed women around her. They were a formidable pair, the cold, powerful Duke and his mysterious, quiet Duchess. They moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances with polite reserve. Francis could feel the curious stares, could almost hear the whispered questions. Was she a prisoner? A provincial mouse terrified by the London lions? Her stepmother and stepsisters were there, holding court in a corner, their expressions a mixture of envy and malice. Lady Alcott caught her eye and gave a small, pitying shake of her head, a piece of theater for the benefit of her audience. The moment of confrontation came sooner than expected. Lord Ashworth, a man whose primary occupation was the collection and dissemination of gossip, approached them, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Your Grace," he said to Alistair, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "a pleasure to see you in society again. And the new Duchess." He gave Francis a dismissive glance. "We were all so intrigued by the unusual circumstances of your marriage." The challenge was laid. The circle of listeners tightened. This was the moment the ton had been waiting for. Alistair did not bristle. He did not defend. He turned to Francis, his expression calm, and placed his hand over hers where it rested on his arm. Then he looked at Lord Ashworth. "You are mistaken, my lord," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute authority. "The circumstances were not unusual. They were fortunate. I found myself in need of a partner with more intelligence, grace, and integrity than any woman in this room." A collective, soft gasp went through the onlookers. "I discovered my wife managing an estate on the brink of ruin with a skill that would shame my own steward. The Duchess is not merely the mistress of my home. She is its chief architect. Harrington is a better place because she is in it." The statement was revolutionary. He had not praised her beauty, her lineage, or her charm. He had praised her mind, her competence, her work. He had publicly named her value in a world that valued women for everything but that. He had validated her not as an ornament, but as a partner. Lord Ashworth was left speechless. The crowd's perception shifted in an instant, the whispers changing from speculation to a new, profound respect. Francis saw the stunned, furious face of her stepmother, her social maneuver utterly defeated. Alistair looked at Francis, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Their work here was done. Without another word, they turned and walked from the ballroom, leaving a sea of stunned aristocrats in their wake. They had arrived as a mystery. They left as a union. Spring came to Harrington Hall not as a gentle suggestion, but as a vibrant, determined force. The gardens, which had been Frances's first project, her first patch of earth to claim and nurture, responded in a riot of color. The roses she had painstakingly pruned and staked now climbed the old stone walls, their blossoms releasing a heady perfume into the air. The paths she had cleared with her own hands led through beds of bluebells and daffodils. The entire space, once a monument to neglect and sorrow, was now thrumming with life. It was here, on a warm afternoon with the scent of damp earth and new blossoms in the air, that she and Alistair walked. The formal distance they once maintained had vanished, replaced by an easy closeness. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together in a way that felt both new and entirely natural. For a long time, they walked in a comfortable silence. The only sounds the birds in the ancient oaks and the crunch of their shoes on the gravel path. "I have been a poor student of my own contract," Alistair said at last, his voice quiet. They had stopped by the old, restored fountain, its water now burbling cheerfully. "I believe I have violated every clause concerning emotional involvement." A smile touched Frances's lips. She turned to face him, her hand still held firmly in his. "As have I," she admitted. "I accepted a position, and I seem to have acquired a home." He looked at her, his gray eyes, once so cold and distant, now filled with a warmth that mirrored the spring day. He raised her hand and brushed his lips against her knuckles, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her heart ache. "Frances," he said, his voice losing its formal ducal tone, becoming simply the voice of a man speaking a profound and simple truth. "The contract is dissolved. The terms are void." He took a breath, as if the next words were both the easiest and the hardest he had ever spoken. "I love you." It was not a declaration made with flourish or poetry. It was stated as a fact, as undeniable as the sun in the sky, as solid as the stone of the house behind them. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and she answered him with the same plain, devastating truth. "And I love you, Alistair." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Inside was not a grand ducal jewel, but a simple, slender gold band, identical to the one she already wore as a wedding ring. "I believe," he said softly, "we should be married. Not by contract, but by choice." He slid the new ring onto her finger beside the old one. They were a perfect match. Two simple bands, signifying a bond that was anything but. They stood together in the garden they had brought back to life, a physical manifestation of the partnership they had built from the ashes of two broken pasts. What began as a transaction had become a truth. What was a cold, empty fortress had become a warm, vibrant home. And what was discarded and broken had become essential and whole. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Harrington Hall. Would you have trusted the Duke enough to accept his cold, logical contract? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. The best alliances, it seems, often begin as the most honest transactions.